What if every moment you've labeled yourself lazy was actually a moment you were protecting yourself from a threat your conscious mind didn't even recognize? The traditional understanding in psychology and popular culture has been straightforward. Procrastination stems from poor time management, lack of discipline, or simply being lazy, unwilling to do what needs to be done. Most people still believe that when they put things off, when they avoid tasks they know they should complete, the problem is fundamentally motivational, that they just don't want it badly enough, don't care enough, aren't disciplined enough. But here's the revelation that dismantles that entire framework. Procrastination has almost nothing to do with laziness or discipline or wanting something enough. It's a sophisticated avoidance mechanism, triggered by automatic thoughts that predict catastrophic outcomes, thoughts that operate so quickly and so far below conscious awareness that you experience them only as resistance, as that familiar feeling of, I can't do this right now, without ever knowing why you can't. And by the end of this video, you won't just understand the real mechanism driving your procrastination, you'll have the precise method to identify the specific catastrophic predictions your mind is making, and the exact steps to disarm those predictions so action becomes possible again. If you've been calling yourself lazy when something else entirely has been happening, subscribe now. This channel reveals the hidden mechanisms behind behaviors you've been misunderstanding for years. The discovery came from asking a question that seems almost too simple. What are you thinking in the exact moment before you decide to procrastinate? Not what you think about procrastination in general, not your theories about why you avoid things, but the specific thought that passes through your mind in that critical window between considering an action and choosing not to take it. When you examine that moment with precision, when you slow down the mental process enough to see what's actually happening, you find something remarkable. There's always a prediction, always a forecast about what will happen if you start. And that prediction is never neutral. It's never, if I start this, something will happen and I'll deal with whatever it is. The prediction is always negative, often catastrophically so, and it appears so quickly and feels so true that you don't recognize it as a prediction at all. You experience it as knowledge of what starting will be like. The predictions follow specific patterns that repeat across different people and different tasks. The performance prediction, if I start this, I'll do it badly, and that will prove I'm incompetent. The overwhelm prediction, if I start this, I'll be flooded with anxiety and won't be able to handle it. The exposure prediction, if I start this and show my work to others, they'll see my inadequacy and judge me harshly. The perfectionism prediction, if I start this and can't do it perfectly, the imperfect result will be worse than no result at all. The energy prediction, if I start this now, I won't have the energy to sustain it and I'll fail anyway, so why start? Each of these predictions creates what feels like a rational reason to delay. If starting really would lead to proof of incompetence, overwhelming anxiety, harsh judgment, worse than nothing results, or inevitable failure, then not starting seems like the intelligent choice. The problem isn't that you're lazy. The problem is that you're responding rationally to predictions your mind is presenting as certainties. But these predictions are not certainties. They're not even accurate probabilities. They're catastrophizations generated by a threat detection system that's miscalibrated, interpreting the discomfort of effort as danger, treating the possibility of imperfect performance as existential threat, confusing vulnerability with catastrophe. Your mind is doing what evolution designed it to do, protect you from harm. But it's applying threat detection mechanisms that evolved for physical survival to situations that involve psychological discomfort, and in that misapplication, it's creating predictions that are wildly exaggerated compared to actual likely outcomes. Starting a task will not prove you're fundamentally incompetent. It might reveal that you need to learn or practice, but that's information, not proof of essential inadequacy. Starting a challenging task will create some discomfort, but discomfort is not the same as being overwhelmed to the point of inability to function. Showing imperfect work to others might result in some criticism, but criticism of your work is not the same as comprehensive judgment of your worth as a person. The reason you don't see through these predictions is that they operate at a level below conscious reasoning. You don't think, I predict that starting this will prove I'm incompetent and therefore I should avoid it. That would be too explicit, too easy to examine and question. Instead, you just feel resistance. You feel a pull away from the task. You feel that familiar sense that now is not the right time, that you should wait until you're in a better mood or have more energy or feel more prepared. And because you're not aware of the catastrophic prediction driving this resistance, You interpret the resistance itself as evidence of laziness or lack of discipline, which then becomes another reason to feel bad about yourself, which increases your overall distress, which makes the catastrophic predictions even more intense the next time you consider starting something. Breaking this cycle requires making the unconscious predictions conscious. You have to catch them in the act, and the method for catching them is specific. When you notice yourself avoiding a task, when you feel that familiar resistance, you stop and ask yourself not, "Why am I procrastinating?" but, "What am I afraid will happen if I start right now?" And you wait for the answer. Not the reasonable, socially acceptable answer like, "I'm afraid I won't have time to do it well," but the real answer, the catastrophic prediction lurking underneath. "I'm afraid I'll start and immediately feel overwhelmed and prove to myself that I can't handle anything difficult. I'm afraid I'll produce something mediocre, and everyone will see that I'm not as capable as they thought. I'm afraid I'll fail, and that failure will confirm what I already suspect, that I'm fundamentally inadequate." These predictions sound dramatic when stated explicitly, but they're operating implicitly every time you procrastinate, generating the resistance you experience as inability to start. Once you've identified the catastrophic prediction, you can examine it the same way you'd examine any prediction, by looking at evidence and probability. What evidence do you have that starting will actually produce the catastrophic outcome you're predicting? Not evidence that starting might be uncomfortable or challenging. Evidence that the specific catastrophe you're predicting will occur. When you apply this standard, you almost always discover that the evidence is minimal or non-existent. You're predicting that you'll be so overwhelmed you can't function, but you have decades of evidence of functioning through discomfort. You're predicting that imperfect work will lead to comprehensive judgment and rejection, but you have no actual evidence that others judge your total worth based on individual pieces of work. You're predicting that you'll fail completely, but you have substantial evidence of succeeding at many things and learning from the things where you didn't succeed initially. The next step is examining what actually happens when you start despite the prediction. This is crucial because your mind has been operating on these predictions for so long, has been avoiding to prevent the predicted catastrophes for so long, that it has no recent data about what actually occurs when you start. The predictions go untested, which means they maintain their credibility. But when you deliberately start despite the catastrophic prediction, when you use the prediction as a hypothesis to be tested rather than as truth to be obeyed, you gather real evidence. And almost universally, that evidence contradicts the prediction. You start the task and you don't feel overwhelming anxiety. You feel some discomfort, some activation, but it's manageable. You produce imperfect work and people don't comprehensively judge you. They offer feedback, or they don't notice the imperfections, or they appreciate the work despite its flaws. You attempt something difficult, and you don't fail catastrophically. You struggle, you learn, you adjust, you make progress. Each instance where you start despite the prediction and the catastrophe doesn't occur weakens the prediction's automatic power. The prediction still appears the next time you consider starting, because predictions that have been running for years don't disappear after one contradictory experience, but they appear with slightly less conviction. And if you continue the practice of starting despite predictions and observing actual outcomes, the predictions gradually lose their ability to stop you. They become background noise rather than authoritative voices. You notice them, you recognize them as the catastrophizations they are, and you start anyway because you have accumulating evidence that what they predict doesn't actually happen. But there's a deeper layer to this that most people miss, even after they've learned to identify and test catastrophic predictions. The predictions themselves are maintained by core beliefs about yourself, beliefs that operate at a level even deeper than the specific predictions about specific tasks. These core beliefs are usually some variation of, "I am inadequate," "I am unworthy," or "I am defective," and these beliefs generate catastrophic predictions as a way of protecting themselves. If you believe at a core level that you're inadequate, then any situation where your adequacy might be tested becomes a threat. Not a threat to your physical safety, but a threat to the belief's stability. Because if you attempt something and succeed, that generates evidence against the core belief of inadequacy. And your mind, having organized itself around this belief for years or decades, resists evidence that contradicts it. So it generates catastrophic predictions that prevent you from attempting things where you might succeed, because success would destabilize the belief system. This is why procrastination often intensifies around the most important opportunities. The opportunities where success is most possible are also the opportunities that generate the most threatening evidence against core beliefs of inadequacy. So your mind generates its most dramatic, catastrophic predictions around these opportunities, ensuring that you avoid them, ensuring that you don't gather evidence that might require you to fundamentally revise your beliefs about yourself. And from the outside, this looks like self-sabotage. Why would you avoid the exact opportunities that could most benefit you? But from the inside, from the perspective of a mind organized around a core belief of inadequacy, you're not sabotaging yourself. You're protecting yourself from the destabilization that would come from discovering that your core belief about yourself might be wrong. Understanding this deeper mechanism doesn't immediately resolve procrastination, but it changes your relationship to it fundamentally. You're no longer someone who's lazy or undisciplined. You're someone whose mind is generating catastrophic predictions as a way of maintaining coherence with deep beliefs, and those predictions create resistance that you've been misinterpreting as motivational failure. This reframe is not about making excuses, it's about accurate diagnosis. You cannot solve a problem you've misidentified. If you think procrastination is about laziness, you'll try to solve it with more discipline, more willpower, more self-criticism, and those approaches will fail because they're addressing the wrong problem. But if you understand that procrastination is about automatic catastrophic predictions maintaining core beliefs, you can address the actual problem. You can identify the predictions, test them against reality, gather contradictory evidence, and gradually modify the core beliefs that generate the predictions. The practical method combines several elements that must work together. First, when you notice resistance to starting something, you identify the catastrophic prediction. What specifically do you fear will happen if you start? Second, you examine evidence for and against this prediction. What actual evidence suggests the catastrophe will occur? What evidence suggests it won't? Third, you conduct a behavioral experiment. You start despite the prediction and observe what actually happens, treating the prediction as a hypothesis to be tested rather than truth to be obeyed. Fourth, you record the outcome. Did the catastrophe occur? What actually happened? How accurate was the prediction? Fifth, you examine the pattern over time. Are your predictions consistently more catastrophic than outcomes? What does that tell you about the reliability of these predictions? This process needs to be repeated not once or twice, but dozens of times before the pattern shifts. Your mind has been running catastrophic predictions for years without you questioning them. It will take consistent questioning over time to weaken their automatic authority, but the questioning does weaken them. Each time you start despite a prediction and nothing catastrophic happens, you're gathering data. Each time you examine a prediction and realize it's not based on evidence, you're training your mind to be more skeptical of these predictions. Each time you identify a core belief generating predictions and you find evidence contradicting that belief, you're beginning the process of belief modification. The transformation isn't that you suddenly become someone who never procrastinates. The transformation is that procrastination becomes information rather than identity. When you notice yourself avoiding something instead of concluding, "I'm lazy," you ask, what catastrophic prediction just appeared? When you feel resistance, instead of judging yourself as lacking discipline, you examine what your mind is forecasting. When you put something off, instead of adding shame to the experience, you investigate what threat your mind is detecting. Procrastination becomes a signal pointing to predictions that need examination, beliefs that need questioning, rather than evidence of fundamental character failure. And as you work with this understanding over time, as you accumulate experiences of starting despite predictions and outcomes being far less catastrophic than predicted, something profound happens. The predictions begin appearing less frequently and with less intensity. Not because you've eliminated the core beliefs entirely, though those do begin to modify with accumulated contradictory evidence, but because your mind learns through experience that these predictions are unreliable, that starting is not as dangerous as the predictions claim, that the discomfort of effort is not the same as catastrophe. Your relationship to your own resistance changes. You can feel resistance and still start because you know the resistance is based on predictions rather than reality. This is freedom from procrastination, but not in the way most people imagine. You don't become someone who's always motivated, who never feels resistance, who effortlessly completes everything immediately. You become someone who can start despite resistance, who can act despite predictions of difficulty, who can move forward despite discomfort. The resistance may still appear, the predictions may still arise, but they no longer have the power to stop you because you've tested them enough times to know they're catastrophizing rather than forecasting. You've gathered enough evidence of starting and surviving, of attempting and learning, of being imperfect and remaining worthy, that the predictions lose their credibility. They become weather patterns moving through your consciousness rather than unquestionable commands about what's safe and what's dangerous. The path from procrastination as identity to procrastination as information, from being controlled by catastrophic predictions to recognizing and testing them, is walked through consistent practice of the method. Identify the prediction. Examine the evidence. Start despite it. Observe what actually happens. Record the pattern. Repeat until the predictions lose their power. This isn't glamorous work. It doesn't produce instant transformation, but it produces real transformation. Transformation that lasts because it's based on evidence you've gathered yourself, rather than on motivation that fades or willpower that depletes. You're not trying to overcome laziness because you were never lazy. You're learning to recognize catastrophic predictions for what they are, to test them against reality, and to act based on evidence rather than on untested forecasts. That's the real work. That's the path. And it's available to anyone willing to stop believing they're lazy and start examining what they're actually afraid of.